Our first story comes from someone who learned that some neighbours think being neighbourly means making unilateral decisions about your property. My neighbour cut down my tree without asking. I came home from the grocery store last Tuesday to find a tree service crew in my front yard with chainsaws. They were about halfway through cutting down the beautiful maple tree that's been growing in my front yard for probably 20 years. I ran over and asked what the hell they were doing, and the crew leader looked confused. He said Harold from next door had hired them to remove the tree because it was blocking his view of the street. I told them to stop immediately because that was my tree on my property, but they'd already cut through most of the trunk. The tree was basically destroyed at that point. Harold came walking over from his house, acting like nothing was wrong. He said the tree had been bothering him for months because it blocked his view when he backed out of his driveway. He figured I wouldn't mind since it would make the neighbourhood look cleaner. I was speechless. This man had hired a crew to cut down a tree that wasn't his, on property that wasn't his, without asking me or even telling me. When I pointed out that he'd just destroyed a tree that probably took decades to grow, he shrugged and said, "Trees grow back." He offered to pay for half the removal cost since we were neighbours and should help each other out. I called the police, but they said it was a civil matter since Harold genuinely thought he was doing something neighbourly. The tree service company said Harold had seemed confident it was his tree and had paid them up front. They offered to plant a new sapling, but obviously that's not the same as the mature tree that was there before. Harold has been avoiding me ever since. When I tried to talk to him about paying for a replacement tree, he said I was being unreasonable and that good neighbours compromise. He suggested we split the cost of planting something smaller that wouldn't block anyone's view. The worst part is that other neighbours have been asking me why I'm making such a big deal about it. Like Harold cutting down my tree is somehow my fault for being upset about it. I ended up having to hire a lawyer to send Harold a demand letter for the cost of replacing the tree. My homeowner's insurance won't cover it because it wasn't storm damage or an accident. It was just my neighbour deciding my landscaping didn't work for his preferences. The tree removal company left this huge stump in my yard, and now I have to pay someone else to grind it down and reseed the grass. That story is over. The casual destruction of a 20-year-old tree like it's a weed that needed trimming is absolutely mind-blowing. Harold really thought he could just hire a tree service to modify someone else's property and call it neighbourly compromise. Some people have zero concept of boundaries. Speaking of people who don't understand boundaries, this next story takes place on public transportation, where someone decided reservation tickets are more like gentle suggestions. A stranger tried to claim my reserved train seat. I was travelling from Chicago to Milwaukee for work last month and had paid extra for a reserved seat because I needed to finish a presentation during the trip. When I boarded the train, there was already someone sitting in my seat. Her name was Maya, and she had spread out her belongings across both seats like she was settling in for a long journey. I politely showed her my ticket and explained that she was in my reserved seat. Maya barely looked up from her phone and said all the seats were basically the same. So what did it matter? I pointed to the seat number on my ticket, and then to the number above the seat she was occupying. She said seat numbers were just suggestions and that she'd gotten there first, so she should be able to stay. I explained that I'd specifically paid for this seat because it had a table where I could work on my laptop. Maya said I could work anywhere, and that she was comfortable where she was. When I asked where her ticket said she should be sitting, she admitted she didn't have a reserved seat at all. She just picked this spot because it looked nice and figured no one would bother her about it. The conductor came by about 10 minutes later, and I explained the situation. Maya immediately started arguing that it was ridiculous to make someone move when there were other empty seats available. The conductor checked my ticket, confirmed it was my reserved seat, and asked Maya to move. She rolled her eyes and said this was the worst customer service she'd ever experienced. Maya gathered her things with dramatic sighs and made comments about how some people are so uptight about rules. She moved to an unreserved seat 3 rows back and spent the next 20 minutes talking loudly on her phone about how she'd been harassed by some business person who couldn't be flexible. I could hear her telling someone that I'd been rude and aggressive when I'd literally just asked for the seat I'd paid for. The conductor apologised and said this happens more often than people think. Apparently, some passengers just sit wherever they want and hope no one will challenge them. Maya kept glaring at me for the rest of the trip and made pointed comments about seat hogs whenever she walked past my row to use the bathroom. That story is over. The confidence to just claim someone else's reserved seat and then act victimised when asked to move is truly something else. Maya really thought paying customers should just accept whatever's left over because she got comfortable first. Our next tale comes from someone who learned that some roommates have a very creative definition of emergency expenses. My roommate sold my PS5 while I was away. I went home to visit my parents for 2 weeks over winter break, and when I came back to my apartment, my PlayStation 5 was gone from the entertainment centre. I looked everywhere, thinking maybe I'd moved it or someone had borrowed it, but it was definitely not in the apartment. When my roommate Cole got home from work, I asked him if he'd seen it. Cole got this weird look on his face and said he had something to tell me. He explained that he'd been short on rent money and had panicked because he didn't want to get evicted. He said he'd tried to borrow money from friends and family, but nobody could help him out. So he'd decided to sell my PS5 to cover his portion of rent, with the plan to buy me a replacement as soon as he got paid. I was stunned. I asked him how he thought it was okay to sell something that belonged to me without asking. Cole said he knew I'd be upset, but it was an emergency, and he figured I'd understand once he explained. He promised he was going to buy me a new one within a few weeks and that I probably wouldn't even notice. It was gone while I was visiting family. I asked Cole where the money went, if it was supposed to cover rent. Our rent wasn't even due for another week, and he should have gotten paid before then anyway. That's when he admitted he'd used some of the money for other things he needed. When I pressed him for details, he eventually confessed that he'd gotten a new tattoo and bought a sound system for his car. Cole insisted that these were also necessities because the tattoo was for a job interview, and the speakers were broken in his car. I pointed out that neither of those things were actual emergencies, and that he'd basically stolen my gaming system to pay for luxuries. He got defensive and said I was being dramatic because it was just a game console and he was planning to replace it anyway. I demanded that Cole return my PS5 immediately or pay me back the full value. He said he couldn't do either because he'd already spent the money and the person he'd sold it to lived in another state. He offered to pay me back $20 a week until it was paid off, which would have taken months. When I said that wasn't acceptable, he accused me of being a bad friend who didn't care about his financial struggles. I ended up having to involve our landlord because Cole tried to claim that I'd given him permission to sell it. The landlord said roommate disputes weren't his problem, but he did confirm that Cole had paid his rent on time that month. I'm moving out as soon as my lease is up because I can't trust someone who thinks my belongings are available for sale whenever he needs quick cash. That story's over. Selling someone's expensive gaming console for tattoo money and then calling it an emergency rent situation is some next-level mental gymnastics. Cole really thought a few weeks of $20 payments would make up for stealing and selling his roommate's property. This next story takes us to the gym, where someone learned that not everyone understands the concept of personal workout space. A guy at the gym kept adding weight to my barbell mid-set. I was at my usual gym doing deadlifts when this guy named Evan started hovering around my area. I was working through my sets with a weight I'd carefully calculated based on my current strength level. Evan kept watching me, lift and shaking his head like I was doing something wrong. After my second set, Evan walked over and said I wasn't challenging myself enough. He said he'd been watching my form and could tell I was capable of much more weight. I thanked him for the input, but explained that I was following a specific training program and knew what weight was appropriate for my goals. Evan said most people underestimate their abilities and that he wanted to help me break through my mental barriers. During my third set, Evan actually walked over and started adding weight plates to my barbell while I was in the middle of lifting. I had to quickly re-rack the weight because the sudden change threw off my balance completely. I asked him what he was doing, and he said he was helping me level up by forcing me to lift heavier than I thought I could. I told Evan to stop interfering with my workout and to let me train at my own pace. He said I was being defensive and that all great athletes need coaches to push them past their comfort zones. When I pointed out that he wasn't my coach and I hadn't asked for help, he said that's exactly the attitude that keeps people from reaching their potential. Evan kept following me around the gym and offering unsolicited advice about every exercise I did. When I moved to bench press, he positioned himself to spot me without being asked and kept encouraging me to add more weight. I told him multiple times that I didn't want help, but he said safety was everyone's responsibility, and he was just looking out for me. The situation escalated when Evan tried to add weight to my barbell again during a squat set. This time, the added weight nearly caused me to lose my balance, and I could have been seriously injured. I re-racked the weight and told Evan that he needed to leave me alone, or I was going to report him to gym management. He said I was being ungrateful and that he was only trying to help me become a better athlete. I ended up having to talk to the front desk staff about Evan's behaviour. They said they'd speak with him about respecting other members' personal space during workouts. Evan apparently told them that I was resistant to constructive feedback and that he was just being friendly. I haven't seen him since then, but the whole experience made me realise how dangerous it can be when someone decides to help without being asked. That story is over. Adding weight to someone's barbell while they are actively lifting is not motivation, it's assault with a deadly weapon. Evan could have seriously injured someone with his unsolicited coaching techniques. Looking at that situation with Evan, some people really need to learn that helping without permission isn't helping at all. Speaking of neighbours who don't understand basic property rights, this next story comes from someone who discovered that some people think property lines are more like gentle suggestions than actual legal boundaries. My neighbour built a fence through my garden. I've lived in my house for about 8 years, and I've spent countless hours creating this beautiful vegetable garden in my backyard. It's got raised beds, a drip irrigation system, and rows of tomatoes, peppers and herbs that I've been carefully tending for years. Last month, I came home from work to find my neighbour, Frida, measuring around the back corner of my garden with a tape measure and some wooden stakes. I walked over and asked what she was working on. Frida said she was planning to put up a privacy fence between our properties and was just figuring out where the property line should go. I told her that was fine, but pointed out that the actual property line runs right along the edge of my patio, not through the middle of my garden beds. She said she'd looked at it and the current setup didn't feel right to her. I explained that when I'd bought the house, the survey had clearly shown where our property ended and hers began. Frida said surveys could be wrong and that she'd done her own measurements based on what seemed fair. She'd decided that the property line should run straight across from her back corner to mine, which would put about 4 feet of my garden on her side of the fence. The next week I came home to find fence posts being installed right through my vegetable beds. The crew had torn up 3 of my raised beds and destroyed probably $50 worth of plants that were just starting to produce vegetables. I ran outside and told them to stop, but they said they were just following the property markers that Frida had given them. Frida came over and explained that she'd hired the fence company to install the barrier along what she considered the real property line. I showed her the survey from when I'd bought the house, but she said that document was old and didn't account for how the yard had naturally evolved over time. She pointed to some trees and said they created a more logical boundary than whatever was on my paperwork. I called the city to report what was happening, and they sent out a surveyor to check the actual property lines. Sure enough, the fence was about 4 feet into my yard, and Frida had destroyed my garden beds on land that legally belonged to me. The surveyor marked the real boundary with official stakes and told Frida she'd have to move her fence. Frida argued with the city surveyor for almost an hour. She kept insisting that the official property line didn't make sense and that her version was more practical for both of us. When the surveyor explained that property boundaries are legal documents, not matters of personal opinion, Frida said the whole system was stupid and inflexible. The fence company had to come back and remove all the posts they'd installed in my yard. Frida was furious about having to pay for the extra work and kept saying I was being unreasonable about a few feet of dirt. She acted like I was the problem for wanting my actual property back, instead of just accepting her version of where the line should be. I had to replant all the vegetables that got destroyed and rebuild the raised beds that were damaged during the fence installation. Frida hasn't spoken to me since the city made her move the fence, and she leaves passive-aggressive notes about property taxes and neighbourly cooperation on my car windshield. That story's over. Imagine thinking you can just redraw property lines based on what feels right to you. Frida literally destroyed someone's garden because she disagreed with legal documents and measurements. The confidence to argue with a city surveyor about official property boundaries is truly something else. This next story takes us to a shopping mall where someone learned that some people think taking photos of strangers is a perfectly normal hobby. A stranger followed me around a store taking photos of my outfit. I was shopping at the mall last weekend, just browsing through some clothing stores and trying on a few things. I was wearing this vintage band t-shirt I'd found at a thrift store with some high-waisted jeans and boots, nothing super fancy, just a casual outfit that I felt good in. While I was looking through the sale rack at one store, I noticed this woman named Tina standing nearby with her phone pointed in my direction. At first I thought maybe she was texting someone or taking a selfie, but then I realised she was definitely taking pictures of me. When I looked directly at her, she didn't even try to hide what she was doing. I walked over and asked if she'd been photographing me. Tina smiled and said yes. She loved my outfit and wanted to recreate the look for herself. She said she'd been following me through the store, taking pictures from different angles, so she could remember all the details. I told her I wasn't comfortable with being photographed by a stranger and asked her to stop. Tina seemed genuinely confused by my request. She said it was a compliment that she liked my style enough to want to copy it. She showed me her phone and had already taken probably 20 photos of me from behind, from the side, and even some close-ups of my boots and accessories. She said she was just being efficient by documenting everything instead of trying to remember it all later. I explained that taking photos of people without permission wasn't okay, even if it was meant as a compliment. Tina said she wasn't hurting anyone, and that I should be flattered someone thought my outfit was worth copying. She pointed out that we were in a public place where anyone could see what I was wearing anyway. When I insisted that she delete the photos, Tina said that seemed extreme, since she was just using them for fashion inspiration. She offered to show me her Instagram, where she posted outfit recreations, and said I could even get credit as her inspiration if I wanted. I told her again that I didn't want to be photographed, and that she needed to respect that. Tina rolled her eyes and said I was being paranoid about something completely harmless. She said fashion bloggers take street-style photos all the time, and that I was overreacting to normal behaviour. She kept her phone out and continued taking pictures, while telling me I should be more open to sharing my style with others. I ended up having to get mall security involved because Tina wouldn't stop following me and taking photos. The security guard explained that photographing people without consent could be considered harassment, and he asked Tina to delete the images and leave me alone. She complained that everyone was being ridiculous about a few innocent pictures. Even after security talked to her, I saw Tina lurking around other stores in the mall with her phone out, apparently looking for other people to photograph for her fashion inspiration collection. The whole experience made me realise how vulnerable you can feel when someone decides you're their photography subject without asking. That story is over. Following someone around a mall taking photos from every angle isn't fashion inspiration. It's stalking with a creative excuse. The fact that Tina genuinely couldn't understand why this was inappropriate makes it even more disturbing. Our next story involves a neighbour who came up with a truly innovative way to monetize someone else's property. My neighbour tried to charge me to use my own driveway. I live in a house with a long driveway that runs right up to my garage. It's clearly on my property and has been part of my daily routine for the 3 years I've lived here. My neighbour Ron lives in the house next door, and we've always been polite but not particularly close. Last Tuesday morning, I came out to leave for work and found orange traffic cones blocking the entrance to my driveway. Ron was standing in his yard watering plants, and I walked over to ask him if he knew what was going on with the cones. He said he'd put them there, and that we needed to discuss the new parking arrangement. Ron explained that he'd been thinking about the situation and decided that my driveway was causing problems for the neighbourhood. He said cars using my driveway created traffic and noise that disturbed his peace and quiet. He'd taken it upon himself to control access to my driveway to reduce the disturbance to his property. I pointed out that it was my driveway on my land and that I needed to be able to park there. Ron said he understood my position, but that he also had rights as a neighbour to peaceful enjoyment of his property. He'd come up with what he considered a fair solution. I could pay him $10 per day for a permit to use my driveway. I stared at Ron for a moment, trying to process what he'd just said. He was seriously proposing that I pay him money to park on my own property. When I explained that this was completely insane, Ron said he'd researched neighbourhood parking issues online and found that many communities use permit systems to manage traffic. Ron pulled out a folder full of printed articles about residential parking problems and permit solutions. He'd highlighted sections about how homeowners can work together to reduce congestion and noise. He seemed genuinely convinced that charging me to use my own driveway was a reasonable community improvement initiative. I told Ron to move the cones immediately because he had no authority to block access to my property. He said the cones would stay until we worked out a fair agreement about the parking situation. He offered to reduce the daily fee to $8 if I paid for a weekly permit in advance. When I moved the cones myself, Ron replaced them an hour later. He left a laminated sign explaining the new permit system and included a phone number where I could call to purchase daily or weekly parking passes. The sign was professionally made, like he'd actually invested time and money into this scheme. I called the police about Ron blocking my driveway, and they came out to talk to both of us. The officer explained to Ron that he couldn't charge people to use their own property and that blocking someone's driveway was illegal. Ron argued that he was trying to improve neighbourhood quality of life through organised parking management. The officer made Ron remove all the cones and signs and warned him that blocking my driveway again would result in charges for harassment and property interference. Ron seemed genuinely disappointed that his parking permit business wasn't going to work out. He said he'd put a lot of thought into creating a fair system for everyone. That story is over. Ron really thought he could start a parking permit business using someone else's driveway as his main asset. The fact that he made professional signs and researched community parking solutions shows this wasn't just a random impulse, but an actual business plan. This next story takes us to the world of food delivery, where someone discovered that some people think porch packages are basically a community buffet. A stranger took my food delivery off my porch. I'd ordered dinner from my favourite Thai restaurant through one of those delivery apps. It was a Friday night, I was exhausted from work, and I just wanted to eat some pad Thai and watch Netflix. The app showed that my food had been delivered and left at my front door around 7:30. When I went to get my dinner about 10 minutes later, there was nothing on my porch. I checked around the sides of the house thinking maybe the driver had put it somewhere else, but there was no sign of any food delivery. I checked the app again, and it definitely showed the order as delivered to my address. I was about to call the restaurant when I remembered I have a doorbell camera that records when people approach the front door. I pulled up the footage and saw the delivery driver drop off my food right where he was supposed to. But then, about 5 minutes later, a woman I'd never seen before walked up to my porch, picked up my dinner, and walked away with it. The woman on the camera was probably in her 30s, wearing workout clothes and walking a small dog. She didn't look around or seem hesitant at all. She just strolled up like she was picking up her own order, grabbed my food, and continued on her walk. She even waved at the camera on her way out, like she was being friendly to whoever might be watching. I couldn't believe someone would just take food that obviously wasn't theirs. The delivery bag had the restaurant's logo and was sitting right next to my door, with my house number clearly visible. There was no way this woman could have genuinely thought it was meant for her. I posted the camera footage on our neighbourhood social media group, asking if anyone recognised the woman who'd taken my dinner. Several neighbours replied saying they'd seen her walking around the area before, but nobody knew her name or where she lived. One person said they'd seen her taking packages from porches in the past, but hadn't thought to report it. Within a few hours, someone identified the woman as Cleo, who lived about 3 blocks away. Apparently, she'd been having ongoing issues with her own food deliveries getting stolen, so she'd started taking other people's orders instead of dealing with the problem. Several neighbours came forward saying they'd had food or packages go missing, and now suspected Cleo might be responsible. I decided to walk over to Cleo's house with the camera footage and ask for my food back, or at least the money to replace it. When I knocked on her door, she answered, still wearing the same workout clothes from the video. I explained who I was and showed her the footage of her taking my dinner. Cleo looked at the video and shrugged. She said she'd been having problems with people stealing her deliveries, so she figured she'd just take someone else's instead of losing money. She said it all evened out in the neighbourhood since everyone was dealing with the same theft issues. She offered to split the pad thai with me since she hadn't eaten it all yet. I told Cleo that stealing other people's food wasn't a solution to her own delivery problems and asked her to pay me back for the dinner she'd taken. She said that seemed unfair since she was also a victim of porch theft and was just trying to survive in a neighbourhood where nobody respected anyone else's property. The conversation was going nowhere, so I told Cleo I was going to report the theft to the police if she didn't make things right. She said calling the cops over pad thai was an overreaction and that I should try to be more understanding of her situation. She eventually gave me $20 and said she hoped we could be better neighbours going forward. That story is over. Cleo's logic that stealing someone else's food balances out her own theft problems is truly impressive mental gymnastics. The casual wave at the camera while committing the crime shows a level of confidence that's almost admirable in its audacity. That story is over. Turning porch theft into some kind of neighbourhood barter system is peak entitled behaviour. The casual wave at the camera while stealing dinner shows the kind of confidence that only comes from truly believing you're in the right. Our next story comes from someone who learned that some wedding guests think child-free means everyone except their special little angel. My friend brought their kid to my child-free wedding. I spent months planning what I thought was going to be the perfect wedding. My fiancé and I decided early on that we wanted a child-free ceremony and reception. We love kids, but we wanted one day that was just for adults to celebrate, without worrying about crying during vows or kids running around the dance floor. We put child-free clearly on our invitations and wedding website. We even called our close friends and family members who had kids just to make sure everyone understood. Most people were completely fine with it and made arrangements for babysitters or just planned a nice date night out. But my friend Vince apparently had other ideas. The morning of my wedding, I was getting ready in the bridal suite when my wedding coordinator knocked on the door. She said there was a situation with one of the guests that needed my attention. Apparently, Vince had shown up to the ceremony with his 4-year-old son Tommy in tow. When the coordinator explained that it was a child-free wedding, Vince had insisted there must be some mistake. I called Vince from the bridal suite and asked what was going on. He said his babysitter had cancelled last minute and he didn't want to miss my wedding. I reminded him that we'd specifically discussed the child-free policy when we sent invitations, and he'd confirmed he understood. Vince said he remembered that conversation, but figured it would be okay to make an exception for just one kid. I explained that if we made an exception for Tommy, other parents would be upset that they'd arranged childcare unnecessarily. Vince said that seemed like overthinking the situation, and that Tommy was really well behaved. He promised his son would sit quietly and wouldn't cause any disruptions. I told Vince I was sorry about his babysitter situation, but the policy applied to everyone. Vince got defensive and said I was being unreasonable about my own friend's child. He pointed out that Tommy had known me since he was a baby and that excluding him seemed mean-spirited. He said real friends would be flexible in emergency situations and that I was prioritizing rules over relationships. I suggested that Vince could attend the ceremony and then take Tommy home before the reception, or skip the wedding entirely and we could celebrate together another time. Vince said that compromise wasn't fair because he'd already driven 2 hours to get there and had bought a gift. He kept insisting that one child wouldn't make a difference to anyone. The conversation went in circles for about 15 minutes while I was supposed to be getting my final touches done for photos. Finally, I told Vince that Tommy couldn't stay for the wedding and that he needed to decide what he wanted to do. Vince said he'd find somewhere for Tommy to wait during the ceremony, but that seemed to miss the point entirely. What happened next still makes me angry. Vince decided to bring Tommy into the ceremony anyway, and just hope I wouldn't make a scene on my wedding day. During the processional, I could see them sitting in the third row with Tommy, playing with toy cars on the pew. Other guests were looking around, confused because they'd all followed the child-free rule. Tommy was actually pretty quiet during the vows, but that wasn't really the issue. The issue was that Vince had completely disregarded our wishes for our own wedding. During the reception, Tommy got tired and cranky and started crying during our first dance. Vince had to take him outside, which created a distraction during what was supposed to be a special moment. Several other guests came up to me during the reception, asking why some people got to bring kids when they'd been told not to. I had to explain that Vince had just shown up with Tommy, despite being told the policy. Some parents said they would have brought their own children if they'd known exceptions were being made. The whole situation put a damper on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead of focusing on celebrating with my new husband, I spent part of my wedding dealing with drama that could have been avoided if Vince had just respected our clearly stated wishes. He still doesn't understand why I was upset and keeps saying it was just one kid. That story is over. Nothing says friendship like completely ignoring the bride's explicitly stated wishes and then acting confused about why that's a problem. Vince really thought showing up with a kid would force them to bend the rules rather than enforce them. Speaking of neighbours who think rules don't apply to them, this next story comes from someone whose yard became a free playground for someone else's pet. My neighbour let their dog dig up my lawn. I spent all spring working on my front yard, reseeding bare patches and trying to get the grass to grow in thick and green. It was finally starting to look decent after years of neglect from the previous homeowner. Then my neighbour Anya got a new puppy, and apparently my yard became its favourite digging spot. The first time I noticed the problem, there were 3 or 4 holes scattered across my front lawn. They weren't huge, but they were definitely fresh holes that hadn't been there the day before. I figured maybe it was rabbits or something, so I filled them in with dirt and reseeded the spots. The next morning, there were twice as many holes, and this time I could see paw prints around them. I looked over at Anya's yard and noticed she was outside with her golden retriever puppy. The dog was maybe 6 months old, full of energy, and apparently loved to dig. I watched as the puppy ran straight from her yard to mine and started excavating another hole right in front of my porch. I called over to Anya and pointed out that her dog was digging up my lawn. She laughed and said, "Puppies will be puppies," like it was the most natural thing in the world. She said the puppy was just exploring and would probably grow out of the digging phase. I explained that I'd just reseeded the grass and asked if she could keep her dog in her own yard. Anya said dogs don't understand property lines and that it was impossible to control where they want to dig. She suggested I should be flattered that her puppy liked my yard enough to play there. When I pointed out that the holes were destroying the grass I'd worked hard to establish, she said, "Grass grows back," and I was worrying about nothing. Over the next week, the digging got worse. Every morning, I'd come outside to find new holes scattered across my front lawn. Some of them were deep enough that I could lose my footing walking across the yard. The puppy had completely destroyed the areas where I'd just planted new seed, and the grass was starting to look like a minefield. I talked to Anya again and asked if she could put the puppy on a leash when it was outside. She said leashing dogs in their own yard was cruel and that pets needed freedom to run around. She pointed out that her backyard was fenced, but the puppy preferred playing in the front yard, where it could see people walking by. I suggested that maybe Anya could install a fence in her front yard, or use one of those invisible fence systems to keep the puppy contained. She said fencing was expensive, and that invisible fences were mean because they shocked dogs. She seemed genuinely puzzled about why I cared so much about a few holes in the dirt. The situation escalated when I caught Anya actually standing in my yard, watching her puppy dig, while I was trying to fill in the previous day's holes. She was laughing and taking pictures like it was the cutest thing she'd ever seen. When I asked her to get her dog off my property, she said I was being uptight about something harmless. I ended up having to call animal control because Anya refused to do anything about the problem. They explained to her that she was responsible for keeping her pet on her own property and that property damage from uncontrolled animals could result in fines. Anya complained that everyone was ganging up on her over normal puppy behaviour. The officer made Anya put the puppy on a leash when it was outside in the front yard and warned her that continued property damage could result in citations. She grumbled about having neighbours who don't like animals and said she'd never lived somewhere with such strict rules about pets. The digging stopped after that, but I had to completely redo my front lawn because of the damage. That story is over. Standing there taking photos while your dog destroys someone's yard is the kind of neighbour behaviour that starts property line wars. The idea that property damage is just puppies being puppies shows a remarkable disconnect from reality. Our next tale takes us to a thrift store, where someone learned that some people think trying on clothes means you own them. A stranger tried to swap their jacket for mine at a thrift store. I was browsing through the clothing racks at my local thrift shop last weekend when I found this amazing vintage leather jacket. It was exactly my size, in great condition, and priced at only $15. I tried it on, and it fit perfectly, so I decided to buy it and wore it while I continued shopping through the store. I was looking through some books when this guy named Lars walked up to me and complimented the jacket. He said it looked really cool and asked where I'd found it. I told him it had been on the rack near the back of the store and that there might be other similar jackets in that section. Lars said he'd check it out and wandered off toward the clothing area. About 10 minutes later, Lars came back carrying a denim jacket that was clearly too small for him. He said he'd found this other jacket, but it didn't fit right, and he wondered if I'd be interested in trading. I told him thanks, but I was happy with the leather jacket I'd already picked out. Lars looked disappointed and said the denim jacket was actually a better brand and worth more money. I thanked him again for the offer, but said I wasn't interested in swapping. That's when Lars started getting weird about it. He said the leather jacket looked better on him, and that I should try the denim one because it would suit my style better. He held up the denim jacket like he was doing me a favour by offering the trade. I explained that I'd already decided to buy the leather jacket and wasn't looking to trade with anyone. Lars said that was selfish because the leather jacket clearly meant more to him than it did to me. He offered to pay me the $15 price difference if I'd switch jackets with him. When I declined again, he said I was being unreasonable about sharing. Lars started following me around the store trying to convince me to trade jackets. He kept pointing out features of the denim jacket and saying it was higher quality than the leather one. He said I obviously didn't know much about vintage clothing if I couldn't recognise a good deal when I saw one. The situation got really strange when Lars tried to just take the leather jacket off my shoulders while I was looking at some dishes. I stepped back and told him to keep his hands to himself. He said he was just trying to show me how much better the jacket looked on him. He actually started putting on the leather jacket over his own clothes. I told Lars that I was buying the jacket and he needed to give it back immediately. He said we should let other shoppers vote on who looked better in each jacket, like it was some kind of fashion contest. He seemed genuinely convinced that public opinion would support his claim to my jacket. I had to get one of the store employees involved because Lars wouldn't give back the leather jacket. The employee explained that once someone decides to purchase an item, other customers can't just take it or demand trades. Lars argued that thrift stores were supposed to be about community sharing and that I was being possessive. The employee made Lars return the leather jacket and explained that harassing other customers wasn't acceptable behaviour. Lars complained that the store's policy was unfair to people who really appreciated vintage clothing. He said I probably wouldn't even wear the jacket properly. I bought the jacket and left, while Lars was still arguing with the employee about thrift store etiquette. That story is over. The confidence to physically remove clothing from someone's body and declare it looks better on you is absolutely unhinged behaviour. Lars really thought a thrift store was some kind of communist clothing exchange where everything belongs to whoever wants it most. This next story comes from someone who discovered that some neighbours think security lighting means blinding everyone within a 50-foot radius. My neighbour installed a motion light that shines into my bedroom all night. I've always been a light sleeper, so when I bought my house, I specifically chose one with a bedroom that faces away from the street to minimise noise and light pollution. For 2 years, I slept perfectly in my nice dark bedroom with blackout curtains and white noise machine. Then my neighbour Irene decided she needed better security lighting for her property. She installed this massive motion sensor floodlight on the side of her house that faces my bedroom window. The light is probably meant for illuminating driveways or large backyards, but she pointed it directly toward the property line between our houses. The first night the light was installed, I woke up around midnight to what looked like the sun rising in my bedroom. The motion sensor had been triggered by something, and this incredibly bright LED floodlight was shining directly through my window. Even with blackout curtains, the light was so intense that it lit up my entire room, like a football stadium. I waited for the light to turn off automatically, but it stayed on for what felt like forever. Every time I was about to fall back asleep, something would trigger the sensor again, and the room would flood with light. I ended up getting maybe 2 hours of sleep because the light kept cycling on and off all night. The next morning, I walked over to talk to Irene about the new light. I explained that it was shining directly into my bedroom and making it impossible to sleep. Irene said the light was necessary for security and that she'd researched the best options for protecting her property. She seemed proud of how bright and effective it was. I asked if there was a way to adjust the angle of the light so it wouldn't shine into my window. Irene said the light was positioned exactly where it needed to be to cover her driveway and side yard. She said security experts recommend having lights that eliminate all dark areas where intruders might hide. I suggested maybe she could install a shade or shield to direct the light downward instead of across the property line. Irene said that would defeat the purpose of having a security light and that modifications might make her property less safe. She said I should just get better curtains if light was bothering me. I explained that even blackout curtains couldn't block out a light that powerful, and that the constant on and off cycling was disrupting my sleep. Irene said that was unfortunate, but her family's safety was more important than my sleep schedule. She suggested I could try wearing a sleep mask or moving to a different bedroom. The light situation got worse over the next week. Apparently, the motion sensor was so sensitive that it triggered every time a cat walked by, or when the wind moved tree branches, or even when cars drove past on the street. My bedroom was basically having a strobe light party every night, from sunset to sunrise. I called the City Code Enforcement Office to ask about regulations on exterior lighting. They said lights couldn't shine directly onto neighbouring properties and that there were rules about the brightness and direction of residential security lighting. They offered to come out and assess whether Irene's light violated any ordinances. The code enforcement officer confirmed that the light was too bright and poorly positioned. He explained to Irene that the light needed to be redirected or shielded, so it only illuminated her own property. Irene argued that criminals don't respect property lines and that effective security lighting needs to cover a wide area. The officer gave Irene 30 days to modify the light or face fines for violating the light pollution ordinance. She complained that the city was prioritising my comfort over her family's safety, and that the regulations were preventing her from protecting her home properly. She said I should have talked to her more before involving the authorities. Irene eventually installed a shield on the light that directs it downward, but she makes passive-aggressive comments about how the neighbourhood is less safe now because of my complaint. She's also installed 3 more lights around her property, all carefully angled to stay within the legal requirements, while still being as bright as possible. That story is over. Installing a floodlight that turns your neighbour's bedroom into a disco is not security, it's psychological warfare. The fact that Irene fought the city code enforcement rather than just angling the light differently shows this was never really about safety. This next story comes from someone who learned that some neighbours think your property makes a perfect free storage unit. A neighbour parked a boat in my yard without asking. I came home from work last Thursday to find a 20-foot fishing boat sitting in the middle of my front yard. Not near the street, not partially on the grass, but fully parked right in the centre of my lawn, with the trailer wheels sinking into the soil I've been trying to get to grow properly all summer. I walked around the boat looking for some kind of note or explanation, but there was nothing. I checked with my immediate neighbours to see if anyone knew whose boat it was, or how it had gotten there. Mrs. Patterson next door said she'd seen a truck pulling it into my yard around noon, but she'd assumed I was expecting it. I called the police non-emergency line to report an abandoned vehicle on my property. While I was waiting for them to arrive, a guy named Duke walked over from the house at the end of the street. He said he'd heard I was asking about the boat and wanted to explain the situation. Duke told me he was the boat owner and that he'd temporarily parked it in my yard because he didn't have room at his place. His garage was full of other stuff, and his homeowners association wouldn't let him keep the boat in his driveway for more than 24 hours. He said he'd looked around the neighbourhood and decided my yard had the most space available. I asked Duke what made him think it was okay to park his boat on someone else's property without asking. He said he'd knocked on my door first, but nobody answered, so he figured it would be fine for a few days. He explained that boat storage was really expensive and that neighbours should help each other out with things like temporary parking. I told Duke he needed to move the boat immediately because I hadn't given permission for him to use my yard as his personal marina. He said that seemed harsh since the boat wasn't hurting anything, and I obviously wasn't using that part of my lawn for anything important. He pointed out that the boat was actually protecting the grass from getting worn out by foot traffic. Duke offered to pay me $20 to let him keep the boat there for another week while he figured out a permanent storage solution. When I declined, he said most people would be happy to make some easy money helping out a neighbour. He seemed genuinely confused about why I was being difficult about something so simple. I explained that I didn't want a boat in my yard regardless of payment, and that he was damaging my lawn with the weight of the trailer. Duke said the grass would bounce back once the boat was moved, and that a little temporary flattening wasn't worth getting upset about. He offered to throw in an extra $10 if I was worried about lawn damage. The police officer who responded was as baffled as I was about someone just parking a boat in a stranger's yard. He explained to Duke that this was trespassing and property damage, and that the boat needed to be removed immediately. Duke argued that it wasn't really trespassing if he'd tried to ask permission first. Duke reluctantly called a friend with a truck to come move the boat, but he kept complaining about how unfriendly the neighbourhood was becoming. He said back in the day people would help each other out instead of calling the police over minor inconveniences. The boat left 2 deep ruts in my yard that I had to fill and reseed. Even after the boat was gone, Duke would stop by occasionally to ask if he could store other items in my yard temporarily. He's offered to park his RV there during the winter months and asked if I'd let him keep some construction materials on my property while he renovated his kitchen. He genuinely seems to think my yard is community storage space. That story's over. The casual confidence to turn someone's front lawn into your personal boat dock is absolutely staggering. Duke really thought knocking on the door once gave him perpetual parking rights to someone else's property. Speaking of people who think physical space belongs to whoever wants it most, this next story takes place at a concert where someone decided front row was a state of mind. A stranger at a concert tried to push me out of my spot. I'd been looking forward to seeing my favourite band for months when they announced a show at our local venue. I got to the concert hall 3 hours early and waited in line to make sure I could get a spot right up front near the stage. By the time doors opened, I was fifth in line and managed to secure a perfect position right at the barrier. I'd been standing there for about an hour, talking with other fans and enjoying the opening act, when this woman named Lola showed up with 2 friends. They squeezed into the crowd behind me and immediately started complaining loudly about how they couldn't see the stage very well from where they were standing. Lola tapped me on the shoulder and said she was shorter than me and wondered if I could move back a few spots so she could get a better view. I politely explained that I'd been waiting in line for hours to get this spot and that I wanted to stay where I was. She said that was understandable, but pointed out that her height disadvantage meant she deserved priority placement. When I didn't move, Lola started positioning herself directly behind me and pushing forward every few minutes. At first it felt like normal crowd movement, but then I realised she was deliberately trying to squeeze past me to get to the barrier. Every time I'd step forward to maintain my position, she'd push up closer behind me. The situation escalated when the main act took the stage and everyone got more excited. Lola used the increased energy and movement in the crowd to start physically pushing me sideways. She'd bump into me during loud songs and try to slide into the space next to me at the barrier. Her friends were helping by creating pressure from behind. I turned around and told Lola directly that she needed to stop pushing me and stay in her own space. She said the crowd was naturally moving and that I couldn't claim ownership of a specific spot in a general admission venue. She insisted that concerts were about shared experiences and that I was being selfish by hogging the front row. Lola's pushing got more aggressive during the band's biggest hits. She'd used the excitement of other concert goers to justify shoving forward, and she started stepping on my feet and elbowing me in the ribs. When I complained, she said I was being too sensitive about normal concert behaviour and that maybe I should move to a less crowded area if I wanted personal space. The breaking point came when Lola actually grabbed my shirt and tried to pull me backward while pushing forward herself. I had to brace against the barrier to avoid being moved, and several other people around us started telling her to stop being so aggressive. She said everyone was overreacting to standard concert dynamics. I finally got the attention of security and explained that someone was trying to physically remove me from my spot. The security guard watched Lola for a few minutes and saw her continuing to push and shove. He told her she needed to find her own space and stop harassing other concert goers, or she'd be removed from the venue. Lola complained that security was ruining the concert experience by preventing people from moving around naturally. She said I'd obviously never been to a real concert before if I expected to stay in one spot all night. She eventually moved to a different area, but spent the rest of the show glaring at me and making comments about people who don't understand music venue etiquette. That story is over. Using someone's height as justification to physically assault them at a concert is truly innovative reasoning. Lola really thought being short gave her the right to bulldoze through people who'd been waiting for hours. Our next story involves a neighbour's teenager who decided someone else's roof looked like the perfect viewing platform. My neighbour's teen climbed my roof to watch fireworks. The 4th of July was last weekend, and our city always puts on a big fireworks display at the park about a mile from my house. You can see them pretty well from most of the neighbourhood, but apparently that wasn't good enough for my neighbour Kurt's 17-year-old son Brandon. I was getting ready to go outside and watch the fireworks from my backyard when I heard footsteps and voices coming from above my head. At first I thought maybe a squirrel or raccoon had gotten onto the roof, but then I heard definitely human voices and what sounded like a cooler being dragged across the shingles. I walked out into my yard and looked up to see Brandon and 3 of his friends sitting on my roof like it was a public bleacher section. They had lawn chairs, snacks, drinks, and what looked like a Bluetooth speaker playing music. They'd apparently climbed up using a ladder they'd brought from Brandon's garage and were treating my roof like their personal fireworks viewing party. I called up to them and asked what they were doing on my roof. Brandon looked down and waved like we were old friends. He said the view of the fireworks was way better from up there than it was from ground level. He explained that they'd tested different roofs in the neighbourhood and mine had the best angle for watching the show. I told the kids they needed to come down immediately because they weren't allowed on my property, let alone on my roof. Brandon said the fireworks were about to start and that they'd come down right after the show ended. He promised they weren't hurting anything and would clean up any mess they made. I explained that having people on my roof was dangerous and could damage the shingles and that they definitely didn't have permission to be there. Brandon said they were being careful and that modern roofs were built to handle weight. He offered to split the cost of any repairs if they accidentally broke something. While I was arguing with Brandon, the fireworks started and all 4 kids started cheering and taking selfies. They were jumping up and down on my roof, apparently forgetting that they were 20 feet off the ground on someone else's property. I could hear the shingles creaking under their movement. I went inside and called Kurt to tell him his son was on my roof with friends. Kurt sounded embarrassed and said he'd told Brandon to watch the fireworks from their own yard. He came over immediately and called up to Brandon to come down, but Brandon said they'd be down in just a few minutes when the show ended. The fireworks lasted about 30 minutes, and the kids stayed up there the entire time. They were loud, playing music, and apparently eating messy snacks because I could see wrappers and crumbs falling off the roof into my gutters. When the show finally ended, they took their time packing up their stuff and didn't seem to be in any hurry to leave. When they finally climbed down, I went up on my roof the next morning to assess the damage. There were several cracked shingles where they'd been walking around, scuff marks from their chairs, and trash scattered across the entire area. The worst part was that they'd apparently spilled soda or something sticky that had dried on the shingles. Kurt offered to pay for the roof repairs, but said boys will be boys, and that I should take it as a compliment that my roof was the best spot in the neighbourhood. He seemed to think the whole thing was more amusing than serious, even though the damage was going to cost several $100s to fix properly. Brandon never apologised, and actually asked if he could use my roof again for the next fireworks show, since it had worked out so well. When I said absolutely not, he seemed genuinely disappointed and said I was being unreasonable about sharing a good view with neighbours who appreciated it. That story is over. Turning someone's roof into a private party deck without permission is the kind of behaviour that should come with automatic liability insurance. The casual request to book the roof for future shows is almost impressive in its complete lack of awareness. This next story comes from someone who learned that some friends think borrowing means taking whatever they want, whenever they want it. My friend took my expensive camera on a trip without permission. I've been building up my photography equipment collection for about 2 years now, and last spring I finally saved up enough to buy this amazing DSLR camera with a really good lens. It cost me almost $1,500, which was a huge investment for me, but I've been wanting to upgrade my gear for so long. My friend Gia knew how excited I was about the camera because I'd been talking about saving up for it for months. She'd seen me using it at a few events we'd attended together, and she'd always been impressed with the photos it took. Gia had mentioned a few times that she wished she had a camera like that for her own travel photos. Last month, I went out of town for work for about a week. The night before I left, Gia called and asked if she could borrow my camera for a weekend trip she was taking with some college friends. I told her I was uncomfortable lending out such an expensive piece of equipment, especially since I was going to be travelling myself and wouldn't be around if something went wrong. Gia seemed disappointed, but said she understood my concerns about the camera. She asked if I had any other camera she could borrow instead, maybe an older one that wouldn't be such a big deal. I offered to let her use my old point and shoot camera, but she said that wouldn't give her the kind of photos she was hoping for on her trip. When I got back from my work trip, I went to get my camera out of the closet where I always store it, and it wasn't there. I looked through my entire apartment thinking maybe I'd moved it somewhere else before travelling, but I couldn't find it anywhere. I started to panic thinking someone had broken in and stolen it. I was about to call the police when I remembered that Gia had a spare key to my apartment from when she'd helped me move in a few months earlier. I called her and asked if she'd been in my apartment while I was gone. There was this long pause before she said yes. She'd borrowed the camera after all. Gia explained that she'd thought about our conversation and decided I was just being overly cautious about lending it out. She said she knew I wouldn't mind once I saw the amazing photos she'd taken on her trip. She'd used her spare key to get the camera while I was out of town and had planned to put it back before I returned. I was furious that she'd taken the camera without permission after I'd specifically said no. Gia said she'd figured it was better to ask forgiveness than permission, and that she'd been extra careful with the equipment. She promised she'd taken great care of it and that I'd love seeing the photos from her trip. When Gia brought the camera back the next day, I immediately noticed that the lens had a crack in it. When I pointed this out, she got defensive and said the crack was probably already there, and I just hadn't noticed it. She insisted she'd been extremely careful and that the camera had worked perfectly throughout her entire trip. I showed Gia photos I'd taken with the camera right before my work trip, and the lens was clearly undamaged in those images. She finally admitted that she'd accidentally knocked the camera over while packing for her trip, but said it was just a tiny crack that didn't affect the photo quality. She offered to pay for part of the repair costs since we were friends. The lens repair cost almost $300, and Gia kept finding reasons why she couldn't pay me back right away. She said I was being unreasonable about an accident and that good friends should help each other through mishaps. She still posts photos from her trip online and tags me, saying she couldn't have captured those memories without my camera. That story's over. Using someone's spare key to steal expensive equipment after they've already said no is friendship theft with premeditation. The audacity to suggest the crack was already there when confronted with proof is just the cherry on top of this betrayal sundae. Speaking of people who think other people's belongings are community property, this next story takes us to an airport where luggage ownership became surprisingly negotiable. A stranger tried to take my luggage at baggage claim. I was flying back home from a business conference in Denver, and after a long day of delays, I was exhausted and just wanted to get my suitcase and head home. I was standing at the baggage carousel, waiting for my black rolling suitcase to come around, which admittedly looks pretty similar to a lot of other suitcases. When I saw what looked like my bag coming down the conveyor belt, I walked over and grabbed it. As I was pulling it away from the carousel, this guy named Marcus came rushing over and said I'd taken his suitcase by mistake. I looked at the luggage tag and showed him that it clearly had my name and address on it. Marcus looked at the tag and said that didn't matter because the suitcase looked exactly like his and he'd been waiting for it longer than I had. He said sometimes luggage tags got switched or fell off and that I should trust him since he knew what his own suitcase looked like. He tried to take the handle from my hand. I pointed out that not only did the tag have my name on it, but I could see my distinctive luggage strap wrapped around the handle. Marcus said luggage straps were common and that anyone could have the same colour. He seemed genuinely convinced that I had mistakenly taken his bag and was being stubborn about returning it. I offered to open the suitcase right there to prove it contained my belongings, but Marcus said that wouldn't prove anything because all business travellers pack similar items. He kept insisting that he recognised specific scuff marks and details on the suitcase that proved it was his. He said I was clearly confused about which bag belonged to me. The situation got more ridiculous when Marcus started describing what he claimed was inside the suitcase. He said it contained 3 dress shirts, 2 pairs of pants, and some electronics, which could describe literally anyone's business travel packing. When his descriptions didn't match what I knew was in my bag, he said maybe he'd packed differently than usual. I finally unzipped the suitcase and showed Marcus my clothes, with my name written on the tags. along with my personal items and conference materials with my name on them. He looked at everything for a moment, and then said I must have accidentally picked up his bag at some other point and transferred my stuff into it. Marcus's theory was that I'd somehow confused our identical suitcases earlier in my trip and had been unknowingly using his bag while he'd been stuck with mine. He said this kind of mix-up happened all the time and that we needed to find his bag so we could switch back to the correct luggage. I told Marcus that his theory made no sense and that this was clearly my suitcase based on all the evidence. He said I was being unreasonable and that anyone could see we had a classic case of switched luggage. He wanted me to wait around and help him figure out where his real bag was. Finally, I just walked away with my suitcase while Marcus was still trying to convince me that I had his bag. He followed me toward the exit, continuing to argue that we needed to resolve the luggage situation properly. Airport security eventually had to intervene when he wouldn't stop harassing me about returning what he insisted was his property. That story is over. The mental gymnastics required to insist someone else's clearly labelled luggage belongs to you is Olympic-level delusion. Marcus really thought he could logic his way into taking someone's suitcase based on the theory that all black bags are interchangeable. This next story involves a neighbour who decided vacation houses are actually community centres. My neighbour hosted a party in my backyard while I was out of town. I went to visit my sister for a long weekend in August, and when I got back Sunday evening, my backyard looked like the aftermath of a music festival. There were empty beer cans scattered across my lawn, cigarette butts floating in my pool, and folding chairs that definitely weren't mine set up around my patio. The pool water was murky and had this weird foam floating on top that I'd never seen before. My outdoor furniture had been rearranged, and someone had apparently been grilling because there were food scraps and grease stains on my patio. The worst part was finding broken glass near my back door and what looked like vomit in my flower beds. I immediately called my neighbour Clint to ask if he'd seen anyone in my backyard while I was gone. Clint got this sheepish tone in his voice and said he needed to explain what had happened. He told me he'd decided to throw a small gathering for some friends on Saturday night and had thought my backyard would be perfect for the party. I asked Clint what made him think it was okay to use my property for a party without asking. He said his own backyard was too small for the number of people he'd invited, and he'd noticed that mine had a pool and more space. He figured since I was out of town anyway, I wouldn't mind if he borrowed the space for one evening. Clint explained that he'd originally planned to have just a few people over, but word had gotten out and more friends had shown up than expected. He said things had gotten a little out of hand, but that everyone had a great time and really appreciated having access to such a nice backyard and pool setup. I told Clint I was furious that he'd thrown a party on my property without permission and that he was responsible for all the damage and mess. He said calling it damage was an exaggeration and that most of the mess was just normal party cleanup. He offered to pick up the obvious trash but said things like the pool chemicals would sort themselves out. When I pointed out the broken glass and the state of my pool, Clint said parties sometimes get messy and that I was overreacting to what was essentially just some spilled drinks and normal wear and tear. He said homeowners insurance would probably cover anything that was actually broken. Clint seemed genuinely confused about why I was upset about what he called borrowing the space. He said neighbours should help each other out and that he'd been doing me a favour by keeping an eye on my property while I was gone. He mentioned that some of his friends had complimented my landscaping. I demanded that Clint pay for pool cleaning, lawn repair and replacement of anything that was damaged during his unauthorised party. He said that seemed excessive since he hadn't meant for things to get messy. He offered to help clean up the obvious trash, but said I was trying to make him pay for problems that might not even be related to the party. The pool cleaning alone cost me over $200, and I had to replace several plants that had been trampled or damaged. Clint paid for about half the costs after I threatened to call the police about trespassing and property damage. He still thinks I was being unreasonable about what he calls a minor neighbourly mix-up. That story is over. Treating someone's pool like your personal party venue while they're out of town is neighbour behaviour that belongs in a criminal justice textbook. The suggestion that homeowners' insurance should cover party damage is almost as outrageous as throwing the party in the first place. Moving from backyard party crashers to coffee shop thieves, this next story shows how some people interpret abandoned property. A person at a coffee shop took my laptop charger while I was in the bathroom. I was working at my usual coffee shop yesterday, set up at a table near the window with my laptop, notebooks, and charger plugged into the wall outlet next to my seat. I'd been there for about 2 hours, working on a presentation when I needed to use the bathroom. I left all my stuff at the table since I was just going to be gone for maybe 3 minutes. My laptop was open, with my work displayed on the screen, my coffee was still half full, and my jacket was draped over the back of my chair. It was obvious that someone was actively using the table and would be right back. When I returned from the bathroom, my laptop charger was gone. I looked around the table thinking maybe it had fallen behind something, but the cord was definitely missing from where I'd had it plugged in. I asked the person at the next table if they'd seen anyone take my charger, and they said a woman named Lynn had unplugged it and left with it just after I'd walked away. I looked around the coffee shop and spotted Lynn at a table across the room with my charger plugged into her laptop. I walked over and politely told her that was my charger and asked if she could give it back. Lynn looked up at me confused and said she'd found the charger abandoned at an empty table and figured someone had left it behind. I explained that the table wasn't empty, that all my stuff was still there, and that I'd just been in the bathroom for a few minutes. Lynn looked over at my table with my laptop and coffee and said she hadn't noticed those things when she'd taken the charger. She said the table had looked unoccupied to her. Lynn seemed reluctant to give back the charger and said she really needed to charge her laptop for an important project. She asked if I could wait until her battery was charged up, maybe another hour or so, and then I could have the charger back. She said sharing charging equipment was just good coffee shop etiquette. I told Lynn that it wasn't sharing when she'd taken my charger without asking, and that I also needed to charge my laptop to finish my work. She said we could take turns using the charger throughout the day, switching back and forth every hour so both of us could get our work done. When I insisted that Lynn return my charger immediately, she got defensive and said I was being possessive about something that was just sitting there unused. She pointed out that coffee shops were shared spaces where people should be considerate of each other's needs for power outlets and charging equipment. Lynn eventually unplugged my charger from her laptop, but she made a big show of how inconvenient this was for her work schedule. She said next time I should put a note on my charger if I didn't want other people to use it. She also suggested that I should carry a backup charger if charging was so important to my productivity. As I was plugging my charger back in at my table, Lynn came over and asked if she could borrow it later when I was done working. She said we'd gotten off on the wrong foot, but that she'd be happy to work out a charging schedule that worked for both of us. She seemed genuinely puzzled when I told her no. That story is over. The logic that a plugged-in charger at an occupied table is abandoned property requires some truly creative interpretation of reality. Lynn's suggestion to work out a sharing schedule for stolen equipment shows a remarkable commitment to making theft sound reasonable. Our final story today involves someone who learned that rideshare confusion can lead to some very awkward car encounters. A stranger tried to get into my car, claiming it was their Uber. I was stopped at a red light downtown last weekend, when suddenly my back door opened, and this stranger tried to get into my car, claiming it was their Uber. I was stopped at a red light downtown last Friday evening when suddenly my back door opened, and this guy named Reed slid into my back seat like he belonged there. I turned around completely startled and asked him what he was doing in my car. Reed looked at his phone and said he was getting into his Uber ride. He showed me his phone screen with what looked like a ride request and said the app had told him this was his car. I explained that I wasn't an Uber driver and that this was my personal vehicle, not a rideshare. Reed looked confused and said the license plate must match what was in his app. I told Reed he needed to get out of my car immediately because I had no idea who he was and he'd just jumped into a stranger's vehicle. Reed said that seemed unlikely because the Uber app was very accurate about matching passengers with the right cars. He insisted on comparing my license plate with whatever was showing on his phone screen. Reed started getting frustrated when I refused to drive him anywhere. He said he'd been waiting for his ride for 15 minutes and didn't understand why I was being difficult about taking him to his destination. He showed me the address he needed to get to and said it wasn't even that far from where we were. I explained again that I wasn't his Uber driver and that he'd made a mistake by getting into my car. Reed said maybe there had been some kind of mix-up with the app, but since he was already in the car, couldn't I just give him a ride anyway? He offered to pay me the same amount he would have paid the actual Uber driver. The light turned green and I had to start driving, but I pulled over at the first safe spot I could find. Reed said stopping wasn't necessary because we were already heading in the right direction. He seemed to think I was being unreasonably picky about the details of how he'd gotten into the car. When I parked and told Reed again that he needed to get out, he said I was being really unhelpful for someone in the service industry. He apparently still believed I was his Uber driver and that I was just having some kind of attitude problem about doing my job properly. Reed started reading me my own license plate number from his phone and insisting it matched my car exactly. When I looked at his screen more carefully, I could see that 2 of the numbers were completely different from my actual plate. I pointed this out, but Reed said the numbers looked close enough and that maybe the app had rounded them or something. I finally had to be very firm and tell Reed that if he didn't get out of my car immediately, I was going to call the police. Reed said that seemed like an extreme response to a simple ride request and that most Uber drivers were more professional about handling customer service issues. Reed eventually got out of my car, but he left a 1-star review on what he thought was my Uber driver profile. He spent several minutes standing next to my car complaining loudly about how rideshare drivers were becoming unreliable and unprofessional. He said the gig economy was going downhill when drivers wouldn't even take passengers to their destinations. As I was driving away, I could see Reed in my rearview mirror trying to get into other cars stopped at the intersection. He apparently decided to keep trying random vehicles until he found his actual Uber ride. The whole experience made me realize how vulnerable you are when someone just decides your car is their transportation. That story is over. Sliding into a random stranger's car and then arguing about service quality when they won't drive you around is peak rideshare confusion. Reed's commitment to believing every car was potentially his Uber created the most awkward traffic stop ever. And there you have it, folks. Another collection of stories that prove some people operate on a completely different set of rules than the rest of us. Whether it's treating your property like community space, your belongings like public resources, or your personal boundaries like gentle suggestions, these encounters remind us that audacity truly knows no limits. These are the stories that make you appreciate the normal, reasonable people in your life who understand basic concepts, like asking permission, respecting boundaries, and not climbing on other people's roofs. Keep these tales in mind the next time you think you're having a bad day with difficult people. At least nobody's trying to charge you rent for your own driveway. I hope you picked up some good strategies for dealing with the truly unhinged people in your life, because unfortunately, we've got more where those came from. Some folks really seem to think the world revolves around their personal convenience, and they'll go to incredible lengths to make that delusion a reality. Speaking of people who redefine property ownership, this next story comes from someone who discovered that asking permission is apparently optional when you want something badly enough. My friend used my house key to steal my expensive camera while I was travelling. I'd been saving up for months to buy this professional DSLR camera setup. Cost me almost $2,000, but I was finally ready to start taking my photography seriously. My friend Gia had always been interested in my photography hobby, and she'd asked to borrow the camera a few times for various events. Last month I had to travel to Portland for a work conference, and the night before I left, Gia called asking if she could borrow my camera for a weekend trip she was taking with some college friends. I told her I was uncomfortable lending out such expensive equipment, especially since I wouldn't be around if anything went wrong. She seemed disappointed but said she understood. When I got back from my trip 5 days later, I went to grab my camera from the closet, where I always keep it, and it wasn't there. I tore apart my entire apartment thinking maybe I'd moved it somewhere else before leaving, but it was definitely gone. I was about to call the police thinking someone had broken in, when I remembered Gia had a spare key from when she'd helped me move in. I called her and asked if she'd been in my apartment while I was gone. There was this long pause before she admitted she'd taken the camera after all. She said she'd thought about our conversation and decided I was just being overly cautious. She figured it would be fine since I was out of town anyway and wouldn't even notice it was gone. When Gia brought the camera back the next day, the lens had a crack running right through the middle of it. When I pointed this out, she immediately got defensive and said the crack was probably already there and I just hadn't noticed. She insisted she'd been extremely careful with it the entire time. I pulled up photos I'd taken right before my trip, and the lens was clearly perfect in those shots. Finally, she admitted she'd accidentally knocked it over while packing for her trip, but said it was just a tiny crack that barely affected the photo quality. She offered to pay for half the repair costs since we were friends, and accidents happen. The lens replacement ended up costing $400, and Gia kept finding excuses for why she couldn't pay me back right away. She said I was being unreasonable about an honest mistake, and that good friends should help each other through these kinds of mishaps. She still posts photos from her trip online and thanks me in the captions for letting her borrow my camera. That story is over. Using someone's spare key to steal their property after they've already said no is friendship betrayal with premeditation. The fact that she damaged it and then tried to gaslight him into thinking the crack was already there just adds insult to injury. Moving from camera thieves to luggage confusion, our next story takes us to an airport where someone learned that matching bag colours apparently override name tags and basic logic. A stranger at baggage claim insisted my suitcase was actually his. I was flying back from a business trip in Chicago, exhausted after a day of flight delays, just wanting to grab my black rolling suitcase and get home. When I saw my bag coming around the carousel, I walked over and pulled it off the conveyor belt. This guy named Marcus immediately came rushing over, saying I'd taken his suitcase by mistake. I showed him the luggage tag with my name and address clearly printed on it. He looked at the tag and said that didn't matter, because the suitcase looked exactly like his and he'd been waiting longer than I had. Marcus said sometimes luggage tags get switched or fall off during handling, so I should trust him since he knew what his own bag looked like. He actually tried to take the handle from my hands, while explaining that all black suitcases look similar, but he could identify specific details that proved this one was his. I pointed out my distinctive luggage strap wrapped around the handle, but he said luggage straps were common and anyone could have the same colour. He seemed genuinely convinced I was confused about which bag belonged to me and was being stubborn about admitting my mistake. When I offered to open the suitcase right there to prove it contained my belongings, Marcus said that wouldn't prove anything because all business travellers pack similar items. He started describing what he claimed was inside: 3 dress shirts, 2 pairs of pants, some electronics, basically what any traveller might pack. I unzipped the bag and showed him my clothes, with my name sewn into the tags, along with conference materials and personal items clearly belonging to me. He stared at everything for a moment and then said, I must have accidentally picked up his bag at some earlier point and transferred my stuff into it. His theory was that we'd somehow switched identical suitcases earlier in my trip, and I'd been unknowingly using his bag while he'd been stuck with mine. He said this kind of mix-up happened all the time, and we needed to find his actual bag so we could switch back properly. I told him his theory made absolutely no sense and walked away with my clearly labelled suitcase. He followed me toward the exit, still arguing that we had a classic case of switched luggage that needed to be resolved properly. Airport security eventually had to intervene when he wouldn't stop harassing me about returning what he insisted was his property. That story is over. The mental gymnastics required to claim someone else's clearly labelled luggage is honestly impressive in its complete detachment from reality. Marcus really thought he could logic his way into stealing a suitcase based on the theory that all black bags are interchangeable. Speaking of people who think other people's property is up for grabs, this next story involves a neighbour who turned unauthorised backyard access into a full-scale event planning business. My neighbour threw a party in my backyard while I was visiting family. I went to see my parents for a long weekend, and when I got back Sunday evening, my backyard looked like the aftermath of a college party. There were empty beer bottles scattered across my lawn, cigarette butts floating in my pool, and folding chairs I'd never seen before arranged around my patio. The pool water was completely murky with some kind of weird foam floating on top. My outdoor furniture had been moved around, and there were grease stains on my patio from what looked like grilling. The worst part was finding broken glass near my back door, and what was definitely vomit in my flower beds. I immediately called my neighbour Clint to ask if he'd seen anything suspicious while I was gone. He got this guilty tone and said he needed to explain what had happened. Turns out he'd decided to host a gathering for some friends Saturday night, and thought my backyard would be perfect for the party. Clint said his own yard was too small for the number of people he'd invited, and since he'd noticed mine had a pool and more space, he figured I wouldn't mind if he borrowed it for one evening. He said I was out of town anyway, so it seemed like the perfect solution. He'd originally planned just a small get-together, but word had gotten out and way more people showed up than expected. He admitted things had gotten a little out of hand, but said everyone had a great time and really appreciated having access to such a nice setup. When I told him I was furious about the damage and mess, Clint said calling it damage was an exaggeration, and most of it was just normal party cleanup. He offered to pick up the obvious trash, but said things like pool chemicals would balance themselves out naturally. I pointed out the broken glass and completely trashed pool, but he said parties sometimes get messy, and I was overreacting to what was basically just spilled drinks and normal wear and tear. He actually suggested my homeowner's insurance would probably cover anything that was legitimately broken. Clint seemed genuinely confused about why I was upset, saying neighbours should help each other out, and he'd been doing me a favour by keeping an eye on my property. He mentioned that several of his friends had complimented my landscaping and said I should feel flattered. The pool cleaning alone cost over $300, and I had to replace several plants that had been trampled. Clint eventually paid for about half the costs after I threatened to involve the police, but he still thinks I overreacted to what he calls a neighbourly misunderstanding. That story is over. Throwing a rager in someone's pool while they're out of town isn't neighbourly house-sitting, it's trespassing with a party theme. The suggestion that homeowners' insurance should cover unauthorised party damage is almost as outrageous as the party itself. Our next tale comes from someone who learned that coffee shop etiquette has some very creative interpretations when people need to charge their devices. Someone at a coffee shop stole my laptop charger while I was in the bathroom. I was working at my usual spot yesterday, laptop open with all my stuff spread out, charger plugged into the wall outlet next to my chair. I'd been there for about 3 hours when I needed to use the restroom. I left everything at my table, laptop still running with my presentation on screen, half full coffee cup, jacket draped over my chair. It was obviously an occupied workspace, and I was only going to be gone for maybe 2 minutes. When I came back, my charger was gone. I looked around thinking maybe it had fallen, but the cord was definitely missing from where I'd had it plugged in. The person at the next table said a woman named Lynn had unplugged it and walked away with it right after I'd left. I spotted Lynn across the room with my charger plugged into her laptop. I walked over and politely explained that was my charger and asked for it back. She looked confused and said she'd found it at what appeared to be an empty table and figured someone had left it behind. I pointed out that my table clearly wasn't empty, my laptop was still running, and all my stuff was there. Lynn looked over at my setup and said she honestly hadn't noticed those things when she took the charger. She said the workspace had looked abandoned to her. She seemed reluctant to return it and said she really needed to finish charging her laptop for an important project. She asked if I could wait until her battery was full, maybe another hour, and then I could have it back. She called it good coffee shop etiquette to share charging resources. When I insisted she return my charger immediately, Lynn got defensive and said I was being possessive about equipment that had just been sitting there unused. She pointed out that coffee shops were shared spaces where people should be considerate of each other's power needs. She eventually unplugged my charger, but made a big show of how inconvenient this was for her work schedule. She said next time I should put a note on my charger if I didn't want people using it, and suggested I should carry a backup if charging was so important. As I was plugging back in at my table, Lynn came over, asking if she could borrow the charger later when I was done working. She said we'd gotten off on the wrong foot, but would be happy to work out a sharing schedule that worked for both of us. That story is over. The logic that a plugged-in charger at an occupied table counts as abandoned property requires some truly Olympic-level mental gymnastics. Lynn's follow-up request to schedule sharing time for the equipment she'd just stolen shows remarkable commitment to making theft sound reasonable. This next story takes us to the world of rideshare confusion, where someone learned that getting into random cars can lead to some very awkward encounters. A stranger jumped into my car at a red light thinking I was their Uber. I was stopped downtown last Friday evening when suddenly my back door opened and this guy named Reed slid into my back seat like he belonged there. I spun around completely startled and asked what the hell he was doing. Reed looked at his phone and said he was getting into his Uber ride. He showed me his screen with what looked like a pickup request and said the app had directed him to this car. I explained I wasn't an Uber driver and this was my personal vehicle, not a rideshare. Reed seemed confused and said that couldn't be right because the app was very accurate about matching passengers with correct vehicles. He insisted on comparing my license plate with whatever was showing on his phone to resolve what he assumed was some kind of technical error. When I refused to drive him anywhere, Reed got frustrated and said he'd been waiting 15 minutes for his ride. He didn't understand why I was being difficult about taking him to his destination, which according to his phone wasn't even that far away. I explained again that I wasn't his driver and he'd made a mistake getting into my car. Reed said maybe there was some mix-up with the app, but since he was already in the car, couldn't I just give him a ride anyway? He offered to pay me whatever the ride would have cost. The light turned green and I had to start driving, but I pulled over immediately. Reed said stopping wasn't necessary because we were already heading in the right direction toward his destination. He seemed to think I was being unreasonably picky about the details. When I parked and told him to get out, Reed said I was being really unhelpful for someone in the service industry. He apparently still believed I was his Uber driver, having some kind of attitude problem about doing my job properly. He started reading my license plate number from his phone, insisting it matched my car exactly. When I looked at his screen, 2 of the numbers were completely different from my actual plate. When I pointed this out, he said they looked close enough and maybe the app had auto-corrected them. I finally had to threaten to call police if he didn't get out immediately. Reed said that seemed extreme for a simple ride request, and that most drivers were more professional about customer service. He eventually got out, but left what he thought was a 1-star review on my non-existent driver profile. That story is over. Sliding into a random person's car and then critiquing their customer service when they won't chauffeur you around is peak rideshare entitlement. Reed's commitment to treating every vehicle as his potential ride created the most awkward traffic stop imaginable. I hope these stories gave you some good perspective on just how creative people can get when they want something that doesn't belong to them. From property line disputes to unauthorized parties, these tales remind us that some folks genuinely believe the world operates according to their personal convenience rather than basic social norms. The pattern you probably noticed is that most of these situations could have been avoided with a simple conversation, but instead turned into full-blown conflicts because someone decided to act first and ask permission never. Whether it's climbing on roofs, stealing delivery food, or charging people to use their own driveways, the creativity of entitled behaviour truly knows no bounds. What's fascinating is how many of these people genuinely seemed confused when confronted about their actions, like they'd never considered that other people might have opinions about their own property and belongings. The disconnect between their sense of entitlement and basic reality creates these almost surreal situations where you're not sure whether to laugh or call security. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that some people think pet ownership means everyone else has to accommodate your animal's bathroom schedule. My neighbour expected me to let their dog use my yard as a toilet. I moved into my house about 6 months ago and spent a lot of time and money getting the front lawn looking decent. The previous owner had basically let it turn into a dirt patch, so I had to reseed everything and carefully water and fertilise to get grass growing again. My neighbour Patricia has this huge German Shepherd named Bruno, who she walks twice a day. For the first few months, everything was normal. She'd walk him past my house on the sidewalk, and they'd continue on to wherever they usually went. But then Patricia apparently decided my freshly grown grass looked like the perfect bathroom spot for Bruno. It started with Patricia just letting Bruno wander onto my lawn during their walks. At first I thought maybe he was just curious about the new grass, but then I realised he was using my yard as his personal toilet every single day. Patricia would stand on the sidewalk, scrolling through her phone, while Bruno did his business right in the middle of my front lawn. I walked outside one morning and politely asked Patricia if she could keep Bruno on the sidewalk instead of letting him use my yard. She seemed surprised by the request and said, "Dogs need to go where they feel comfortable." She pointed out that grass was more natural for dogs than concrete, and that Bruno had gotten used to this spot. Patricia said she always cleaned up after Bruno, but I'd been finding evidence of his visits every day, even when I hadn't seen them walking by. When I mentioned this, she said she must have missed some spots, but that it was good fertiliser for the grass anyway. She seemed genuinely puzzled about why I had a problem with free lawn treatment. I explained that I'd worked hard to establish the new grass and didn't want it getting damaged by daily dog waste. Patricia said I was being unreasonable about normal neighbourhood pet activity and that most people would be flattered that their lawn was attractive to dogs. She said it meant my grass was healthy and appealing. The situation escalated when I started noticing dead patches appearing in my lawn, right where Bruno had been doing his business. When I pointed this out to Patricia, she said that was probably from overwatering or too much fertiliser, not from Bruno's contributions. She suggested I should research proper lawn care instead of blaming her dog. Patricia started getting defensive about my request to keep Bruno off my property. She said public spaces were for everyone to use and that dogs couldn't read property lines. When I pointed out that my front yard wasn't public space, she said neighbours should be more accommodating to families with pets. I finally had to put up a small decorative fence along my property line to keep Bruno from wandering onto my grass. Patricia complained that the fence was unfriendly and made the neighbourhood look less welcoming to pet owners. She said I was creating unnecessary barriers between neighbours who should be helping each other out. Even with the fence, Patricia makes comments about how some people don't understand the responsibilities that come with living in a community with pets. She acts like I'm the problem for wanting to protect my own lawn from daily damage. Bruno still tries to get through the fence sometimes, and Patricia just watches instead of redirecting him. That story is over. The idea that your neighbour's lawn exists primarily as a toilet for your dog is some truly innovative property interpretation. Patricia really thought free fertiliser was such a generous gift that the homeowner should be grateful for the daily deposits. Moving from lawn-destroying dogs to parking lot chaos, this next story involves someone who learned that some people think handicapped spaces are more like suggestions than requirements. A perfectly healthy person parked in the handicapped spot and told me to find somewhere else. My grandmother uses a wheelchair, and I was taking her to a doctor's appointment downtown. The medical building only has about 6 handicapped parking spaces, and when we arrived, 5 of them were already occupied by cars with proper handicapped tags or plates. The last remaining handicapped space had a shiny red sports car parked in it, with no handicapped placard or license plate visible anywhere. I parked in a regular spot further away and had to push my grandmother's wheelchair much further than necessary to get to the building entrance. After the appointment, we came back to find the same sports car still in the handicapped spot. A guy named Trevor was loading shopping bags from the nearby stores into his trunk. I walked over and asked if he had a handicapped parking permit, since I couldn't see one displayed in his car. Trevor looked at me like I was crazy and said he was only parked there for a few minutes while he ran some errands. He said all the other parking spots were too far from the stores and he didn't want to carry his bags across the entire lot. He seemed genuinely annoyed that I was questioning his parking choice. I explained that handicapped spaces were reserved for people who actually need them, and pointed to my grandmother sitting in her wheelchair, waiting by our car. Trevor glanced over at her and said there were other handicapped spots available when he'd parked there. He said first come, first served was how parking worked. Trevor told me I should have planned better and arrived earlier if I wanted a closer parking spot. He said everyone was trying to park conveniently and that I couldn't expect special treatment just because I was with an elderly person. He seemed to think handicapped parking was just premium location parking that anyone could use. When I pointed out that using handicapped spaces without a permit was illegal, Trevor said parking enforcement rarely checked and that most of those spots sat empty anyway. He said it was wasteful to leave convenient parking unused when able-bodied people could make good use of the proximity to store entrances. Trevor actually argued that he was doing the community a service by utilising parking space that would otherwise go unused. He said elderly people probably didn't go shopping as much as younger people, so it made more economic sense for active shoppers to use those spots during peak hours. I told Trevor he needed to move his car immediately so legitimate handicapped parking users could access the space. He said he was almost done loading his bags and would be leaving in just a few more minutes anyway. He acted like I was being impatient about something that would resolve itself naturally. Trevor eventually got in his car and drove away, but not before telling me that people with real handicapped needs should call ahead to make sure appropriate parking would be available. He said planning was part of being responsible about accessibility requirements. He drove off while I was still trying to process the logic of that statement. That story is over. Using handicapped parking because regular spots require too much walking is like using the fire lane because you're in a hurry. Trevor's suggestion that disabled people should call ahead to reserve their own legal parking spaces is truly next-level entitlement. Our next tale comes from someone who discovered that some wedding guests think +1 invitations are more like mathematical suggestions than actual guest counts. My friend brought 6 extra people to my small wedding reception. I was having an intimate wedding with only 40 guests total, and every invitation was carefully planned because the venue had strict capacity limits. My friend Monica was invited with a +1, and she'd confirmed she was bringing her boyfriend Ryan when she RSVP'd 2 months before the wedding. The morning of my wedding, Monica called and said there had been a slight change in her plans. She explained that Ryan's siblings were visiting from out of state, and they'd heard about the wedding. She asked if it would be okay if they tagged along, since they were already in town and dressed nicely. I explained that the reception venue had a firm 40-person limit, and that we'd already provided the final headcount to the caterer. Monica said she understood, but pointed out that a few extra people wouldn't really make a difference at a party. She promised they would be well behaved and wouldn't cause any problems. I told Monica that I was sorry about the timing, but we couldn't accommodate additional guests beyond what was planned. She seemed disappointed and said she'd have to figure out what to do with Ryan's family while she attended the wedding. I suggested they could meet up after the reception ended. When Monica arrived at the venue, she had Ryan plus 4 other people with her. She introduced them as Ryan's siblings and their partners who had driven 8 hours to visit and were excited to celebrate with us. She acted like this was the arrangement we'd discussed on the phone. I pulled Monica aside and reminded her that I'd specifically said we couldn't accommodate extra guests. She said she knew I'd changed my mind once I met Ryan's family and saw how nice they were. She pointed out that they'd already gotten dressed up and driven across town to attend. Monica said the extra guests would barely eat anything and that she'd make sure they didn't take up much space at the reception. She seemed genuinely confused about why I was making such a big deal about a few additional people who were just excited to share in our special day. The venue coordinator came over and explained that we were over capacity and that the additional guests would need to leave due to fire code regulations. Monica argued that the venue looked like it had plenty of room and that the coordinator was being unreasonably strict about arbitrary numbers. Monica's extra guests ended up having to wait in the parking lot during the ceremony and could only come in briefly to congratulate us before leaving. Monica complained that this was embarrassing for Ryan's family and that I was prioritising venue rules over relationships with people who had travelled to support us. The whole situation created drama during what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead of enjoying my reception, I spent time dealing with capacity issues and upset guests who felt unwelcome. Monica still insists she was just trying to include family members who happened to be visiting. That story is over. Bringing 6 people when you RSVP'd for 2 is not a slight change in plans. It's venue mathematics gone rogue. Monica really thought wedding capacity limits were more like gentle suggestions that could be overruled by enthusiasm and nice outfits. This next story takes us to a library where someone learned that quiet study areas apparently have very flexible definitions depending on who's using them. Someone set up a full business meeting in the library's silent study section. I was working on my thesis research in the designated quiet study area of our university library. This section is clearly marked with signs asking for absolute silence and is specifically reserved for people doing serious academic work that requires concentration. I'd been there for about an hour when a woman named Brenda arrived with 3 other people carrying laptops, folders, and what looked like presentation materials. They set up at a large table right in the middle of the silent study section and immediately started having a normal volume conversation about quarterly sales reports. I looked up from my research and gave them the universal library stare that usually signals people to lower their voices. Brenda noticed me looking and waved cheerfully, then continued discussing budget projections with her colleagues at full conversation volume. After about 10 minutes of their business meeting, I walked over and politely pointed out that this was the silent study area and asked if they could either whisper or move to one of the group study rooms. Brenda looked around and said the space seemed perfect for their needs since it was quiet and had good lighting. I explained that the silence was maintained by people not talking and that their conversation was disturbing everyone trying to study. Brenda said they were being very professional and weren't using inappropriate language or discussing anything disruptive. She seemed to think the content of their conversation mattered more than the volume. Brenda told me that libraries were public spaces meant for everyone to use productively, and that their business meeting was just as valid as academic studying. She said they'd looked for other available spaces, but this area had the best tables and electrical outlets for their laptops. When I pointed to the signs clearly marking the area as silent study only, Brenda said those rules were probably intended for teenagers who might be loud or disruptive. She felt their mature, professional discussion was different from the kind of noise the signs were meant to prevent. The business meeting continued for another hour, with Brenda's group discussing everything from marketing strategies to employee evaluations. Other students kept looking over with annoyed expressions, but everyone was too polite to say anything or seemed to assume someone else would handle it. I finally had to get a librarian involved because the conversation was making it impossible to concentrate on my research. The librarian explained to Brenda that the silent study area required complete quiet and that group discussions needed to happen in designated collaborative spaces. Brenda argued that their meeting was educational and work-related, which should qualify as appropriate library use. She seemed genuinely surprised that professional business discussions weren't welcome in an academic study environment. The librarian had to escort them to a proper meeting room. That story is over. Hosting a quarterly business review in the silent study section is like holding a pep rally in a meditation room. Brenda's belief that professional meetings deserve special exemptions from noise rules shows a remarkable misunderstanding of how libraries work. Speaking of people who creatively interpret public spaces, this next story involves someone who discovered that some beachgoers think prime oceanfront real estate operates on a first-come, first-served basis, regardless of existing occupants. A family tried to claim the beach spot where I'd been sitting all morning. I'd gotten to the beach around 8 in the morning to secure a good spot near the water before the crowds arrived. I set up my umbrella, beach chair, and cooler, then spent about 4 hours reading and enjoying the ocean view in my little claimed area. Around noon, this family of 6 showed up with multiple umbrellas, a portable tent, coolers, and what looked like enough beach equipment to stock a rental shop. The parents, who I later learned were named Chuck and Diana, started surveying the beach for the perfect setup location. Chuck walked over to where I was sitting and said they'd been coming to this exact spot on the beach for the past 5 years and always set up their family base camp right where I was currently positioned. He said it was the best location because it was close to the water but protected from the wind by some nearby rocks. I explained that I'd been sitting there since early morning and wasn't planning to move. Chuck said he understood my position, but pointed out that I was just one person while they were a family with 4 kids who needed more space. He suggested I could easily find another good spot since I had minimal equipment. Diana joined the conversation and said they had a tradition of using this particular area every summer and that it held special sentimental value for their family. She showed me photos on her phone of previous years, with their kids playing in the exact same location where my chair was currently positioned. Chuck offered to help me move my stuff to what he considered an equally good spot about 50 yards down the beach. He said the new location would actually be better for me because it was quieter and had fewer families nearby. He seemed to think he was doing me a favour by relocating me. When I declined to move, Diana said they'd already told their kids this would be their setup area and that the children were excited about building sandcastles in their usual spots. She asked if I really wanted to be responsible for disappointing 4 young kids who'd been looking forward to their traditional beach day. The family started setting up their equipment around my chair, apparently hoping I'd get uncomfortable being surrounded by their stuff and would move on my own. They positioned their umbrellas and tent in a way that blocked most of my sun and created a wind tunnel effect that made my spot less pleasant. Chuck kept making comments about how one person didn't really need such a prime beachfront location and that families should get priority for the best spots since they had more people to accommodate. He said it was just common courtesy to share premium beach real estate with people who could make better use of it. I ended up staying in my original spot out of principle, but spent the rest of the day surrounded by their family camp with kids running back and forth over my towel area. Diana made passive-aggressive comments about people who don't understand beach sharing etiquette and family vacation traditions. That story is over. Claiming someone else's beach spot because you have sentimental attachment to that particular patch of sand is like demanding someone's restaurant table because you proposed there 5 years ago. The idea that family size should override arrival time in beach territory disputes is some truly creative real estate logic. Our next story comes from someone who learned that some people think emergency situations justify some very questionable decision-making about other people's property. My neighbour borrowed my car without asking because theirs wouldn't start. I woke up last Saturday morning to find my driveway empty, where I'd parked my car the night before. My first thought was that it had been stolen, so I started looking around the neighbourhood thinking maybe I'd parked it somewhere else and forgotten. I was about to call the police when my neighbour Felix came walking up the street, carrying a gas can and looking frustrated. When he saw me standing in my empty driveway, he said he needed to explain what had happened with my car. He'd borrowed it early that morning because his own car wouldn't start, and he had an emergency to deal with. Felix explained that his car battery had died overnight, and he'd needed to get to his mother's house immediately because she'd fallen and hurt herself. He'd knocked on my door around 6 in the morning, but I hadn't answered, so he'd used the spare key I'd given him for plant watering to borrow my car for the emergency. Well, there you have it. Thanks for sticking around through all these wild encounters. Whether you were building, studying, or just needed some background chaos while you focused on other things, I hope these stories kept you entertained. The next time you think you're having a bad day, just remember that at least nobody's trying to steal your luggage at the airport or climb on your roof to watch fireworks. Sweet dreams, and I'll catch you in the next one.